Thanks to the new Terran bundle, Star Trek Online now has a new variant of everyone's favorite tough little ship. This one being the new Adamant Heavy Raider. This version of the Defiant is rather different from the previous Tier 6 versions. For one, this new one is a Raider, so it has access to Raider flanking and an abundance of universal seating. The second being that this one has a built-in battle cloak, meaning it won't need that cloaking device console. And in what I think is the most notable difference, unlike the last two, this one doesn't have any pilot seating. The Adamant is actually a full intel ship with a lieutenant level temporal seat. Now let's get into the build and see how well this ship does. Now, like I said, this ship is pretty different from previous versions of the Defiant. This is a Heavy Raider, so really it has more in common with the Core Class Bird of Prey or the Maquis Raider. It has a 5-1 weapons layout, meaning it has one less weapon slot than most escorts, but it makes up for that with Raider flanking, meaning it'll do extra damage against enemies' rear arcs. Because of this, your piloting and positioning are going to be extra important, because you're going to want to keep yourself behind your enemies as much as possible. Fortunately, with how fast and nimble this ship is, that won't be that difficult. Now, if I hadn't already done a build for the Defiant that was inspired by the show's canon, I probably would have done that on this ship. Obviously, I didn't want to just do that again for this video, but it does give me the chance to stick to a similar theme while taking some creative license for the sake of performance. So I guess you can think of this as a beefed up canon-inspired build for the Defiant. And one of the first things I have beefed up is the weapons. In the first weapon slot is the Terran Task Force Phaser Dual Heavy Cannon, and that is because this is one of the most powerful energy weapons in the game, due to its withering radiation proc, and the fact that its damage increases as your target's hull decreases. Next are a pair of Agony Phaser Dual Heavy Cannons. In the last Defiant build I was using just regular dual cannons, but dual heavy cannons are a bit more powerful because they get an extra buff to crit severity, though they also draw more power. I was tempted to go with a third dual heavy cannon, but I also wanted to use this video to try out the new Agony Phaser quad cannons, which are included with this ship. Plus using a Defiant without quad cannons just feels weird. Now these actually really aren't that different from the original quad cannons. The only difference is that this is an Agony Phaser cannon, so they have the Agony Phaser proc, which gives some extra phaser damage over time and has a chance to disable your targets. Whereas the original phaser quad cannons only have the standard phaser proc, which only provides a chance to disable a random enemy subsystem. So these newer quad cannons on the Adamant are actually a bit better. And despite being new, they've actually added these to the original console set. So paired with the Quantum Warhead module, I get a reduced recharge time on my cloaking device, and a short buff to crit chance and crit severity after I decloak. Though because they've added this to the console set, I think that's part of the reason why you can't use both quad cannons at the same time. You're gonna have to choose one or the other, and I would definitely choose this one. And in the last forward weapon slot is the Dark Matter Quantum Torpedo from the Discovery reputation. I used a normal Quantum Torpedo in the last Defiant build, but for this one I wanted to keep the Dark Matter Torpedo. It's more powerful because of the Dark Matter Disillusion effect, and I get the 2-piece bonus with the console, which is a stacking buff to crit severity. Now for my usual energy weapon setup, the Protomatter Deflector from the Fleet Colony for the buffs to crit chance and crit severity, the Competitive Reputation Impulse Engine for the speed buffs, a Plasma Integrated Warp Core from the Fleet Spire for its reduced weapons power cost and its small all-damage buff for every subsystem you have over 75. And the shield from the Discovery reputation for the buff it gives your weapons against enemy shields. In the aft weapon slot is the Trilithium Enhanced Omnidirectional Phaser. This is available from the episode Beyond the Nexus. This is here because its proc gives a chance to buff my weapons haste. There's also a turret version of this weapon, but I chose the Omni Beam for 2 reasons. It fits the semi-cannon theme I'm going for on this ship, because we know the Defiant did have a phaser beam weapon, and because it gives me an excuse to use beam overload. For the experimental weapon, I am using the Terran Repeating Warhead Launcher, which also comes with this ship. Normally I would use Soliton Wave Impeller, but I figured you guys would be curious to see how this new experimental weapon performs. Spoiler alert, it's not terrible, but it's not great either. The other reason I'm using this is because it looks just like the quantum torpedoes that we saw the Defiant use in Deep Space Nine, so it really fits the theme aspects of this build. In the device slots, I've got energy amplifiers for the bonus damage to my energy weapons, deuterium surplus for the speed buff, both of these are craftable consumables by the way, and the Kobayashi Maru transponder for the random buffs. For the consoles, first I have Lorca's Custom Fire Control. This is here for its buff to crit chance, weapons power setting, and shield penetration, and of course for its set bonus with the Dark Matter Quantum Torpedo, which I've already gone over. Down here, I'm sure you all recognize the DPRM and the Domino by now. The DPRM gives a huge buff to bonus damage, while the Domino gives a smaller buff to bonus damage, as well as a nice buff to firing cycle haste. The Temporal Trajectory Shifter is also here for more weapons haste. You really can't have too much of that on energy weapon builds these days. These 3 consoles come off of the Atlas Prototype Dreadnought, Bajoran Interceptor, and Narendra Support Cruiser respectively. Now originally I was going to use the Immolating Phaser Lance here, but instead I decided to use the Quantum Warhead module. For one, it's part of the Defiance item set, so I figured I'd keep it if I'm also going to be keeping the quad cannon. That way I get the set bonus. This is also here because you guys tend to yell at me when I use too many expensive consoles. I feel like I'm already pushing it with the DPRM and the Domino. Now you've probably noticed I'm not using the Cloaking Device console for this set. All the Cloaking Device does is just add a cloak to the ship. It doesn't even have a passive bonus. and all the 3-piece set does is turn that cloak into a battle cloak. However, the Adamant actually comes with its own battle cloak, so it has absolutely no need for that console or the 3-piece set bonus. And of course, to wrap up the consoles are a bunch of vulnerability locators from the Fleet Spire. These are here to buff my crit chance and my phaser damage. The specializations are the same as usual. I'm using Intel Officer as my primary to gain access to space flanking. Fun fact, this will actually stack with Raider flanking, so on a Raider like this, you'll actually be doing even more damage on an enemy's rear arc. And for the secondary, I'm using Temporal Operative to gain access to Entropic Rider, which gives a chance for some physical damage over time with my weapons fire. For the personal traits, I'm actually not going to go into that much detail this time. My personal traits really don't change all that much from video to video, so if you want a better explanation for what they do, go check out one of my previous energy weapon videos, but for this one, I'm just going to list off their names and where they come from. Adaptive Offense, Context is for Kings, Fleet Coordinator, Innocuous, Inspirational Leader, Intel Agent Attaché, Fragment of AI Tech, Superior Cannon Training, Unconventional Systems, Terran Targeting Systems, and the Boimler Effect. Fleet Coordinator, Innocuous, and Cannon Training are all gained as you level up. The superior version of Cannon Training can be unlocked at the K-13 Fleet Holding. Boimler Effect is from the Low-Buy store, but can also be purchased on the exchange, and the rest are from the lockboxes, but can also be purchased on the exchange. For the Starship traits, first I am using Emergency Weapon Cycle from the Arbiter Battlecruiser. Every time I use emergency power to weapons, it'll lower my weapons power cost and buff my firing cycle haste. Overpowered and Overgun comes from the Legendary Defiant. This trait does pretty much the same thing as the last one, but it's triggered off of my energy weapon firing modes. Terran Goodbye from the Mirror Warship gives me a buff to crit chance and accuracy every time I kill an enemy. The Ruin of Our Enemies from the Discovery D7 Flight Deck Carrier. This gives a stacking bonus damage buff every time I kill an enemy. Universal Designs off the Crossfield Refit. This gives a stacking buff to crit chance and crit severity every time I activate a Universal console. Normally I use this with the Immolating Phaser Lance, but the Quantum Warhead module also fires off pretty quickly, so those two can be paired pretty well together as well. And last is Withering Barrage off the Valiant Tactical Escort, and like 6 other ships. Withering Barrage extends the duration of Cannon Scatter Volley by 4 seconds, which, with proper cooldown reduction, will let me keep that active pretty much 100% of the time. Now, I know most of these traits are rather expensive. Obviously, you don't have to use these exact same Starship traits. If you're looking for ideas for good substitutes, I already have a video for that. I'll be sure to link it in the description down below. In the Space Reputation traits, first I have Advanced Targeting Systems for the crit severity buff, Tyler's Duality for the crit chance buff based on my hull capacity, Precision for more crit chance, Magnified Firepower for the bonus damage for my weapons, and Controlled Countermeasures for the bonus damage buff to my weapons against controlled targets. In the Bridge Officer stations, you'll find a lot of universal seating. This first Lieutenant Commander seat I am using as a tactical seat, in which I have Chemosite Lace Weaponry 1 to add some radiation damage to my weapons fire, Beam Overload 2 to buff that Omni Beam, and Torpedo Spread 3 to buff my torpedo. The other Lieutenant Commander seat I'm using for science, Jam Targeting Sensors and Scramble Sensors are both here for unconventional systems triggers, which will help lower the cooldown of my universal consoles. Gravity Well will also trigger unconventional systems, but is also here to get some useful control on my enemies. I know I said that this is a somewhat canon-inspired build, and that Gravity Well is not something I would normally put on a canon-inspired build, but again, like I said, I wanted to make a few compromises for the sake of performance and just for fun. In the Lieutenant Universal/Temporal seat, I'm using Heisenberg Amplifier and Chronometric Inversion Field. Both are also here to trigger unconventional systems. In the Ensign Universal seat, I have an Engineer, which is using emergency power to weapons to trigger emergency weapon cycle. And in the Tactical/Intel seat, first I have Viral Impulse Burst and Electromagnetic Pulse Probe. At least that's what's supposed to be there. While recording this, apparently I had Evade Target lock in the Ensign seat. That's a little embarrassing. Anyway, these two are here also to trigger unconventional systems. Then there's Attack Pattern Beta for the debuff, and Scatter Volley 3 to buff my cannons. In the Duty Officers, first is 26 of 47. With this, my tactical abilities give a chance to buff my damage over time effects, and my temporal abilities have a chance to buff my crit chance. With 27 of 47, my tactical abilities have a chance to buff my crit severity, and my intel abilities have a chance to buff my crit chance. Next are a pair of Projectile Officers, one to buff my crit severity, the other for my crit chance. An Energy Weapon Officer to buff my shield penetration every time I activate Beam Overload. While this Duty Officer triggers off of Beam Overload, the shield penetration will apply to all of my weapons. And finally, 41 of 47 to help with the cooldowns of my temporal abilities and my tactical abilities, though I could trade this one out for 42 of 47, who would help out with my intel abilities instead of my temporal. Now, like I said, this ship is very different from the previous two versions of the T6 Defiant, not just because it's a Raider, but also because of that intel and temporal seat. It affords the ship with a lot of room for unconventional systems triggers, which means this ship has a much higher potential for DPS than the other two. Before we move on to the ISC, there is one last thing I wanted to comment on, and that's this ship's console, Agony Redistributor. You might be wondering why I didn't include it in this build. especially if you've been seeing the kind of damage this console is doing right now. And that's because right now this console is broken. The devs have already confirmed that a fix is on the way, but have also said they're going to be reworking how this console stores its damage, which makes me think this is probably going to get nerfed. I didn't want to show off this console in action just for it to be changed during the next patch. Anyway, with that said, let's move on to the ISE and then the Parse. $333k. That's not bad for a cannon scatter volley build, and also considering we had 2 high parsing control builds in the run, though I probably would have done a bit more if I had timed my cloaking device a bit better. Now the damage the quad cannons did was a little surprising. They did about 42k under cannon scatter volley. Above it you can see what the Agony dual heavy cannons did, a little over 70k. Now that's both of the dual heavy cannons together, so it's reasonable to say that individually both dual heavy cannons did about 35k each, meaning the quad cannon definitely did better. The really surprising part is that the quad cannon beat out the Terran task force cannon, only just barely but still. Though this is just under cannon scatter volley, which is why you're seeing these weapons again in the lower parts of the Parse, because apparently my scatter volley misfired at least once. The Terran repeating warhead did almost 26k, I know Augie has seen this thing get up to 35k. That's not bad for an experimental weapon, but the Soliton Wave Impeller definitely would have done better. Yeah, that is my cannon scatter volley build on the Adamant Heavy Raider. Hope it helps you in making your own. Now in the next video I'll be covering the last of the new Terran ships, the Cygnus battlecruiser. However, what I plan to do with that video is going to be a little bit different than what I've been doing. The Cygnus is best suited to a beam overload build, so it really wouldn't be that much different than what I did with the Lexington. So instead of a straight up build video, I'm going to be using that one to talk about the importance of unconventional systems. The temporal specialization has a lot of abilities that trigger this trait, and the Cygnus being a temporal ship gives me an excuse to talk about this. After that, I'm going to dive back into the Lexington because I've got some goofy theme builds I want to get done for that. And after those, I think I'll finally get the Cannon TOS build video out, because otherwise I'm going to forget about it. So yeah, that's what's to come, but in the meantime, please be sure to like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications. It really does help the channel and I do appreciate it. My name's Stu, and I will see you guys next time.